priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead.
Somebody's shooting in the auditorium. 315 and 314, there is at least one person that's been shot, but they're saying there's hundreds of people just running around.
The king of pop has died.
Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder.
Milwaukee police found body parts in a North Side apartment, and now they wonder if they've uncovered some kind of death factory.
The Virginia Tech shooting was a spree shooting that occurred on Monday, April 16, 2007, comprising 2 attacks on the campus of the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, United States. Seung-Hui Cho, an undergraduate student at the university, the loss of 32 people and wounded 17 others with 2 semi-automatic pistols. 6 others were injured jumping out of windows to escape Cho. The first shooting occurred at West Ambler Johnston Hall, a dormitory where 2 people were killed. The main attack was a school shooting at Norris Hall, a classroom building, where Cho chained the main entrance doors shut and fired into 4 classrooms and in a stairwell, slaying 30 more people. As police stormed Norris Hall, Cho fatally shot himself in the head. It was the worst mass shooting in modern U.S. history and remained so for 9 years until the Orlando nightclub shooting. It remained the deadliest school shooting in U.S. history and the deadliest mass shooting in Virginia history. The attacks received international media coverage and provoked widespread criticism of U.S. gun culture. It sparked debate about gun violence, gun laws, gaps in the U.S. system for treating mental health issues, Cho's state of mind, the responsibility of college administrations, privacy laws, journalism ethics, and other issues. News organizations that aired portions of Cho's multimedia manifesto were criticized by victims' families, Virginia law enforcement officials, and the American Psychiatric Association. Cho had previously been diagnosed with selective mutism and severe depression. During much of his middle school and high school years, he received therapy and special education support. After graduating from high school, Cho enrolled at Virginia Tech. Because of federal privacy laws, the university was unaware of Cho's previous diagnoses or the accommodations he had been granted at school. In 2005, Cho was accused of stalking 2 female students. After an investigation, a Virginia special justice declared Cho mentally ill and ordered him to attend treatment. Because he was not institutionalized, he was allowed to purchase guns. The shooting prompted the state of Virginia to close legal loopholes that had allowed individuals adjudicated as mentally unsound to purchase handguns without detection by the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS. It also led to the passage of the first major federal gun control measure in the U.S. since 1994. The law strengthening the NICS was signed by President George W. Bush on January 5, 2008. Administrators at Virginia Tech were criticized by the Virginia Tech Review Panel, a state-appointed panel tasked with investigating the incident, for failing to take action that might have decreased the number of casualties. The panel's report also reviewed gun laws and pointed out gaps in mental health care as well as privacy laws that left Cho's deteriorating condition untreated when he was a student at Virginia Tech. The shootings occurred in 2 separate incidents. The first incident was in West Ambler Johnston Hall, a residence hall where Seung-Hui Cho killed 2 students. The second incident was in Norris Hall, an academic building on the opposite side of the campus where the other 31 deaths occurred, including that of Cho himself, and all the non-lethal injuries occurred. Cho used 2 semi-automatic pistols during the attacks, a .22 caliber Walther P22 and a 9mm Glock 19. Cho was seen near the entrance to West Ambler Johnston Hall, a co-ed residence hall that houses 895 students, at about 6:47 a.m. Normally, the hall is accessible only to its residents via magnetic key cards before 10 a.m. Cho's student mailbox was in the lobby of the building, so he had a pass card allowing access after 7:30 a.m., but it is unclear how he gained earlier entrance to the building. At around 7:15 a.m., Cho entered the room that freshman Emily J. Hilscher shared with another student and shot Hilscher, a 19-year-old from Woodville, Virginia. After hearing the gunshots, a resident assistant, 22-year-old senior Ryan C. Clark of Martinez, Georgia, attempted to aid Hilscher. Cho shot and killed Clark. Hilscher remained alive for 3 hours after being shot, but no one from the school, law enforcement, or hospital notified her family until after she had died. Cho left the scene and returned to his room in Harper Hall, a dormitory west of West Ambler Johnston Hall. while police and emergency medical services units were responding to the shootings in the dorm next door. Cho changed out of his blood-stained clothes, logged onto his computer to delete his emails and his student university account, and then removed the hard drive. About an hour after the attack, Cho is believed to have been seen near the campus duck pond. Although authorities suspected Cho had thrown his hard drive and mobile phone into the water, a search by divers was unsuccessful. Almost 2 hours after the first killings, Cho appeared at a nearby post office and mailed a package of writings and video recordings to NBC News. These materials proved to be of little investigative value to authorities. The package was postmarked at 9:01 a.m. Norris Hall shootings. Around 9:40 a.m., Cho entered Norris Hall, which housed the engineering science and mechanics program among others. In a backpack, he carried heavy-duty chains and locks, a hammer, a knife, 2 purchased handguns with 19 10 and 15-round magazines, and nearly 400 rounds of ammunition. With the locks and chains, he chained the 3 main entrance doors shut and placed a note on one, saying that attempting to open the door would cause a bomb to explode. Shortly before the shooting began, a faculty member found the note and took it to the 3rd floor to notify the school's administration. At about the same time, Cho had begun to shoot students and faculty on the 2nd floor. The bomb threat was never called in. The first call to 911 was received at 9:42 a.m. Cho geared up in empty room 200 before the shooting began. According to several students, he looked into several classrooms, likely to see how many people were in each room. Erin Sheehan, an eyewitness and survivor who had been in room 207, told reporters that the shooter peeked in twice earlier in the lesson and that it was strange that someone at this point in the semester would be lost, looking for a class. At 9:40 a.m., Cho began shooting. His first attack after entering Norris occurred in an advanced hydrology engineering class taught by G.V. Loganathan in room 206. 13 registered students were inside. Cho shot and killed the professor, then continued firing, killing 9 of the 13 students in the room and injuring 2 others. After exiting the classroom, Cho fired down the hall at 2 students who were fleeing from room 204 next door. The fleeing students managed to escape down the stairwell across the hall. He also fired at another student and substitute professor from room 205 who were peering out from the door, but they survived. He went into room 207, where instructor Jamie Bishop was teaching introductory German. Cho shot Bishop and some students near the door, then walked down the aisle shooting more victims. Bishop and 4 students were killed. 6 other students were shot and wounded. Cho then moved on to Norris 211 and 204, where he was initially prevented from entering due to barricades erected by instructors and students. Hearing the commotion from below, Kevin Granata guided 20 students from a classroom on the 3rd floor into his office, where the door could be locked, and went downstairs to investigate along with another professor, Wally Grant, where they were both shot by Cho in the hallway. Grant, who quickly fled into a bathroom, was wounded and survived, but Granata died of his injuries. None of the students locked in Granata's office were hurt or killed. In room 211 of Intermediate French, Joseline Couture-Nowak saw Cho heading towards the doorway. She and student Henry Lee barricaded the door with a few desks while she yelled at students to get down on the floor and under their desks and call 911. Cho pushed through the barricade and entered the room, killing Nowak and Lee, who fell behind the door. A student named Matthew Laporte, who was a trained Air Force ROTC member of the Virginia Tech Corps of Cadets, charged towards Cho and attempted to tackle him, but died after being shot 7 times during his attempt to save his class. Of the 22 students enrolled in the class, 18 were present at the time of the shooting. In addition to the professor, a total of 11 students were killed and another 6 were injured. The sole uninjured survivor, Clay Violin, played dead and was alongside a wounded female student, one of only 2 people to walk out of the room as soon as police arrived. As in room 207, Cho fired into room 211 from the doorway, and then walked up and down the aisles, methodically targeting potential survivors as they tried to hide. He did not say a single word throughout the shooting and occasionally reloaded his weapon in the hallways before re-entering classrooms to resume shooting. Retracing his path, Cho returned to room 206. According to a student eyewitness, the movements of a student named Wally Cholan, who was already wounded, distracted the aggressor from a nearby student after he had returned to the room. Cholan was shot a second time and died. Also in the same room, another wounded student named Guillermo Coleman was shielded from more serious injury by having the body of student Patahi Lambantoyun placed on top of him. but Coleman's various accounts make it unclear whether he pulled Lumbentorian's body over himself or Lumbentorian initially landed on Coleman after being shot the first time. 2 other students who were also in the room made it out alive. Cho had entered room 206 3 times. After his first entry to room 207, several students had barricaded the door and had begun tending to the wounded. When Cho returned minutes later, Caitlin Carney and spokesperson Derek Odell were injured while holding the door closed, but the remaining students survived. In room 205, students had already barricaded the door with a large table after graduate assistant Haiyan Cheng, who was substituting for the professor, and a student saw Cho heading toward them. Cho shot through the door about 7 times, but failed to force his way in. No one in the classroom was wounded or killed. Across the hall in room 204, Liviu Librescu, a Holocaust survivor from Romania, forcibly prevented the gunman from entering the room by holding the door closed with his body until most of his students escaped through the windows. After kicking open the window screens, the students successfully escaped. Some suffered leg injuries while landing on the ground 2 floors below. Others survived after landing on the shrubbery just below the window, and then ran either to some ambulances pulling up or to the nearest bus stop. Through the door, Librescu was shot 4 times, including through his wristwatch. 2 others who were lying in a corner near the windows were injured, but survived and described that, after most of their classmates escaped through the windows, and after the armed aggressor shot 4 times through the door, he finally forced his way in. Upon seeing the open windows and hardly any students in the room, Cho confronted Professor Librescu and student Minil Panchal, who was lying on the ground next to the door, and fatally shot both in the temple. He then turned to 2 other students who were taking cover and critically injured them before leaving and re-entering room 206 the 3rd time. At 9:50 a.m., 10 minutes after the second shooting began, a SWAT team started to enter the building. They were not able to shoot their way through the chain-locked entrances, but managed entry via a separate entrance. They went up to the 3rd floor, but heard from student Emily Haas, who was wounded and survived in room 211 or Noak's French class, saying that the gunman was in her classroom as she stayed on the line. As police started to descend the stairwell, Cho had already begun to hear the footsteps. He looked out into the hallway briefly, before walking back into the center of room 211 towards the windows and, just as police reached the 2nd floor, shot himself in the temple with the Glock 19 and died instantly. When police arrived at room 211, they saw Cho lying on the ground with his guns beside him, and some students, who were either injured or playing dead, heard the officer's first words, "Gunman down." During the investigation, State Police Superintendent William Flaherty told a state panel that police found 203 remaining rounds of ammunition in Norris Hall on Cho, and later testified that the armed aggressor was well prepared to continue on. During the 2 attacks, Cho killed 5 faculty members and 27 students, 2 students in West Ambler Johnston and 30 people, 5 professors and 25 other students at Norris Hall before he committed suicide. The Virginia Tech Review panel reported that Cho's gunshots wounded 17 others. 6 more were injured when they jumped from 2nd-story windows to escape from Librescu's classroom. Sidney J. Vale, the director of the Trauma Center at Carillion Roanoke Memorial Hospital, said that Cho's choice of 9mm hollow point ammunitions increased the severity of the injuries. 28 of the victims were shot in the head. The shooter was identified as 23-year-old Seung-Hui Cho, a senior at Virginia Tech. He was a South Korean citizen with U.S. permanent resident status who was majoring in English. The Virginia Tech Review panel's August 2007 report devoted more than 20 pages to Cho's troubled history. At 3 years of age, he was described as shy, frail, and wary of physical contact. In 8th grade, Cho was diagnosed with severe depression as well as selective mutism, an anxiety disorder that inhibited him from speaking in certain situations and/or to specific people. While early media reports carried claims by South Korean relatives that Cho had autism, the Massacre report said the relationship between selective mutism and autism was said to be unclear. Cho's family sought therapy for him, and he received help periodically throughout middle school and high school. Early reports indicated Cho was bullied for speech difficulties in middle school, but the Virginia Tech Review panel was unable to confirm this, or other reports that he was ostracized and mercilessly bullied for class, height, and race-related reasons in high school, causing some anti-bullying advocates to feel that the review panel was engaging in an authority-absolving whitewash. Supposedly, high school officials had worked with Cho's parents and mental health counselors to support him throughout his sophomore and junior years. Cho eventually chose to discontinue therapy, When he applied and was admitted to Virginia Tech, school officials did not report his speech and anxiety-related problems or special education status because of federal privacy laws that prohibit such disclosure unless a student requests special accommodation. The Massacre report detailed numerous incidents of aberrant behavior, beginning during Cho's junior year, that illustrated his deteriorating mental condition. Several of Cho's former professors reported that his writing as well as his classroom behavior was disturbing, and he was encouraged to seek counseling. He was also investigated by the university for stalking and harassing 2 female students. In 2005, Cho had been declared mentally ill by a Virginia special justice and ordered to seek outpatient treatment. Cho's underlying psychological diagnosis at the time of the shootings remains a matter of speculation. The Massacre report cited misinterpretations of federal privacy laws when it faulted Virginia Tech officials for failing to share information that would have shed light on the seriousness of Cho's problems. The report pointed to failures by the university's counseling center, flaws in Virginia's mental health laws, and inadequate state mental health services, but concluded that Cho himself was the biggest impediment to stabilizing his mental health in college. The report also said the classification detailed that Cho was to seek outpatient rather than inpatient treatment would generally have been legally interpreted at the time as not requiring that Cho be reported to Virginia's Central Criminal Records Exchange or CCRE and entered into the CCRE database of people prohibited from purchasing or possessing a firearm. Early reports suggested that the killings resulted from a romantic dispute between Cho and Emily Hilscher, one of his first 2 victims. Hilscher's friend said she had no prior relationship with Cho, and there is no evidence that he ever met or talked with her before the murders. In the ensuing investigation, police found a suicide note in Cho's dorm room that included comments about rich kids, debauchery, and deceitful charlatans. On April 18, 2007, NBC News received the package Cho had shipped between the first and second shooting episodes, which contained in one 800-word manifesto, photos, and 27 digitally recorded videos in which he likened himself to Jesus Christ and expressed his hatred of the wealthy, while also referring to Columbine High School massacre perpetrators Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold as martyrs. Cho said, among other things, "You forced me into a corner and gave me only one option. You just loved to crucify me. You loved inducing cancer in my head, terror in my heart, and ripping my soul all this time." Media organizations, including Newsweek, MSNBC, Reuters, and the Associated Press, raised questions about and speculated on the similarity between a stance in one of Cho's videos that showed him holding and raising a hammer, and a pose from promotional posters for the South Korean film Oldboy. Investigators found no evidence that Cho had ever watched Oldboy, and the professor who made the initial connection has since discounted his theory that Cho was influenced by the movie. 104 The Virginia Tech Review panel concluded that because of Cho's inability to handle stress and the frightening prospect of being turned out into the world of work, finances, responsibilities, and a family, he chose to engage in a fantasy in which he would be remembered as the savior of the oppressed, the downtrodden, the poor, and the rejected. The panel went further, stating that his thought processes were so distorted that he began arguing to himself that his evil plan was actually doing good. His destructive fantasy was now becoming an obsession. Police arrived within 3 minutes after receiving the emergency call from Norris Hall, but officers took about 5 minutes to enter the barricaded building. When they could not break the chains, an officer shot out a deadbolt lock leading into a laboratory. They then moved to a nearby stairwell. As police reached the second floor, they heard Cho fire his final shot. Cho's body was discovered in room 211, which was Professor Nowak's classroom. In the aftermath, high winds related to the April 2007 nor'easter prevented emergency medical services from using helicopters for evacuation of the injured. Victims injured in the shooting were treated at Montgomery Regional Hospital in Blacksburg, Carilion New River Valley Medical Center in Radford, Carilion Roanoke Memorial Hospital in Roanoke, Lewis Gale Medical Center in Salem, and Holston Valley Hospital in Kingsport, Tennessee. Orange balloons rising above Lane Stadium, with everyone in the stands wearing maroon or orange, and the stadium scoreboard in the background. The Hokies released 32 balloons before their 2007 football opener as part of a ceremony in the victims' memory. Virginia Tech first informed students of the situation via email at 9:26 a.m. This was about 2 hours after the first shooting, which was thought at the time to be isolated and domestic in nature. After the full extent of the shooting became evident, the university cancelled classes for the rest of the week and held an assembly and candlelight vigil the following evening. on April 17. Norris Hall was closed for the remainder of the semester. The university offered counseling for students and faculty, and the American Red Cross dispatched several dozen crisis counselors to Blacksburg to help students. University officials also allowed students, if they chose, to abbreviate their semester coursework and still receive a grade. The day following the shooting, a memorial event was held at Castle Coliseum. The event included a speech by then-President George W. Bush. The space reached capacity and overflow seating was accommodated at nearby Lane Stadium. Within a day after the shooting, Virginia Tech, whose supporters call themselves Hokies, a nickname coined in a school cheer dating to 1896, formed the Hokie Spirit Memorial Fund, or HSMF, to help remember and honor the victims. The fund was used to cover expenses including, but not limited to, assistance to victims and their families, grief counseling, memorials, communications expenses, and comfort expenses. Early in June 2007, the Virginia Tech Foundation announced that $32 million was moved from the HSMF into 32 separately named endowment funds, each created in honor of a victim killed in the shooting. This transfer brought each fund to the level of full endowment, allowing them to operate in perpetuity. The naming and determination of how each fund would be directed was being developed with the victims' families. By early June 2007, donations to the HSMF had reached approximately $7 million. In July 2007, Kenneth R. Feinberg, who served as Special Master of the Federal September 11th Victim Compensation Fund of 21, was named to administer the fund's distributions. In October 2007, the families and surviving victims received payments from the fund ranging from $11,000 to $500 to $208,000. Early in June 2007, Virginia Tech announced that it would begin to reoccupy Norris Hall within a matter of weeks. The building is used for offices and laboratories for the engineering, science and mechanics, and civil and environmental engineering departments, its primary occupants before the shootings. Plans were to completely renovate the building and for it to no longer contain classrooms. The southwest wing of Norris Hall, where the shootings took place, was closed in 2008 and completely renovated in 2008 and 2009. The building now houses the Center for Peace Studies and Violence Prevention, the Biomechanics Cluster Research Center, and the Global Technology Center, as well as other programs. Ambler Johnston Hall was also closed and renovated. The East Wing now houses the Honors Residential College, which opened in fall 2011. In fall 2012, the West Wing reopened as the Residential College at West Ambler Johnston. After the release of the Massacre report, some of the victims' families called for then-Governor Tim Kaine to relieve Virginia Tech's president, Charles W. Steger, and campus police chief, Wendell Flincham, of their positions. Kaine refused, reasoning the school officials had suffered enough. In the hours and days following the shooting, makeshift memorials to those killed or injured began appearing in several locations on the campus. Many people placed flowers and items of remembrance at the base of the Drillfield observation podium in front of Burris Hall. Later, members of Hokies United, an alliance of student organizations on campus created to respond to shooting, placed 32 pieces of Hokie stone, each labeled with the name of a victim, in a semicircle in front of the Drillfield viewing stand. What was originally termed an intermediate memorial was modeled after the makeshift memorial. The original pieces of Hokie stone placed by Hokies United were offered to the families of the victims. The engraved markers are embedded in a semicircle of crushed gravel with a brick walkway for viewing. There is ground lighting for nighttime illumination and 2 benches, one on either side of the memorial in honor of the survivors. Tech students of South Korean descent initially feared they would be targeted for retribution. While no official claims of harassment were made, anecdotal evidence suggests that some Korean students were affected. The shootings occurred as prospective students were deciding whether to accept offers of admission from colleges and universities. Despite this timing, Virginia Tech exceeded its recruiting goal of 5,000 students for the class of 2011. In the days following the shooting, the campus community received several thousand pieces of artifacts and messages of condolence, arriving from over 80 countries and every state within the US. These included artwork, cards, poetry, and original music. These items were later gathered and photographed by the University Library and are available online. President Bush and his wife, First Lady Laura Bush, attended the convocation at Virginia Tech the day after the shootings. The Internal Revenue Service and Virginia Department of Taxation granted 6-month extensions to individuals affected by the shootings. Governor Kaine returned early from a trade mission to Japan and declared a state of emergency in Virginia. enabling him to immediately deploy state personnel, equipment, and other resources in the aftermath of the shootings. President Bush clasping one of the hands of a student in both of his. President Bush's wife, Laura, is to his left. President George W. Bush comforts Virginia Tech Student Government Association President James Tiger after giving his speech at the school's convocation. Laura Bush looks on. Governor Kine later created an 8-member panel, including former Secretary of Homeland Security Tom Ridge, to review all aspects of the incident, from Cho's medical history to Virginia Tech's delay in warning students after the initial shooting. In August 2007, the panel concluded, among more than 20 major findings, that the Virginia Tech Police Department did not take sufficient action to deal with what might happen if the initial lead proved erroneous. The panel made more than 70 preventive recommendations directed to colleges, universities, mental health providers, law enforcement officials, emergency service providers, lawmakers, and other public officials in Virginia and elsewhere. While the panel did find errors in judgment and procedure, the ultimate conclusion was that Cho himself was responsible for his own actions, and to imply that anyone else was accountable would be wrong. The review panel validated public criticisms that Virginia Tech Police erred in prematurely concluding that their initial lead in the double homicide was a good one, and in delaying a campus-wide notification for almost 2 hours. The report analyzed the feasibility of a campus lockdown and essentially agreed with police testimony that such an action was not feasible. The report concluded that the toll could have been reduced if the university had made an immediate decision to cancel classes and a stronger, clearer initial alert of the presence of a gunman. The incident caused Virginia state lawmakers to re-examine gaps between federal and state gun purchase laws. Within 2 weeks, Governor Kine had issued an executive order designed to close those gaps. Prompted by the incident, the federal government passed the first gun control law in more than a decade. The bill, H.R. 2640, mandates improvements in state reporting to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS, in order to halt gun purchases by criminals, those declared mentally ill, and other people prohibited from possessing firearms, and authorizes up to $13 billion in federal grants for such improvements. Both the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence and the National Rifle Association, or the NRA, supported the legislation. The measure passed the House of Representatives on a voice vote on June 13, 2007. The Senate passed the measure on December 19, 2007. President Bush signed the measure on January 5, 2008. On March 24, 2008, the Department of Education announced proposed changes in the regulations governing education records under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Certain changes address issues raised by the Virginia Tech shooting and are intended to clarify for schools the appropriate balance to strike between concerns of individual privacy and public safety.